Good afternoon. I'm Noel Anderson. I'm the president of the Red River Valley chapter of the American Scientific Affiliation. The American Scientific Affiliation, also known as ASA, was founded in 1941 as a scholarly and professional society, which has grown into an international fellowship of Christians engaged at the interface of science and faith questions. Our Red River Valley chapter meets informally on the third Tuesday of the month. So that's coming up next Tuesday at the food court of the Memorial Union. We also have 6 to 8 meetings every year, similar to this one, which are either formal topics or we participate in the midwinter symposium of the entire ASA. And as you came in and signed up, there is a 8.5 by 11 sheet that has our activities for the year. There's also a little card that talks about science and faith coming together, which gives some additional information about the ASA. And ASA also has a website. It is asa3.org. Don't forget the 3. Don't think it's a 2. Don't think it's a 1. It's asa3.org. And you can find out more information. There's also an opportunity to join. And I am told that we have 5 free memberships for our chapter this year for new members. So if you're interested in joining, check us on how to get one of the free memberships. Our speaker today is Dr. Mark Strand. He is professor of pharmacy practice here at NDSU with emphasis on public health and epidemiology. He did his undergraduate degree in biology at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa. Then went to the University of Minnesota for a Master of Science in Cell Developmental Biology, and then ended up at the University of Colorado, Denver, where he received a PhD in health and behavioral science. He studied Mandarin Chinese and is fluent in that, and worked for a number of years in China in the public health field. He's an elder at Salem Church and has held that position for about 6 years, and has also received theological training through Bethel University and Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And so I'd like to invite Mark forward, and also a reminder to hit record as he gives us our presentation today: Autistic Spectrum Disorder, Epidemiological, Theological, and Pastoral Perspective. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Noel. Autism. When was the first time you heard that word? I think I hadn't heard it much until 2010, when it pressed itself upon me. Today, I would like to answer a couple of questions. How are we to understand the condition of autism from an epidemiological perspective, a theological, and also a pastoral perspective? And are we facing an epidemic? I'm not an expert in neurology or special education, so I'm not going to speak to individual persons like their diagnoses or management. It's because I work at a population level. So if you want help in that area, I'm not going to be your guy. I'm a chronic disease epidemiologist, so my analysis is focusing on the population impacts. But I'm also a human being with family members and friends who live on the autistic spectrum. And I'm concerned about how we as communities and as caring people understand and support neurodivergent persons. So we'll start with the scientific perspective. Epidemiological approaches. I first got riled up about this issue on April 10th when our new Department of Health and Human Service Secretary reported that we were in an autism epidemic. And he made the bold claim that we would solve the problem by September. This struck me as odd for a couple of reasons. One was that it implied we had an emergency, like a natural disaster or an epidemic or an infectious disease outbreak. And that's not how I understood autism. And secondly, it just made me feel as if we're trying to react in a crisis mode for something that's a long and slow moving phenomenon. So first, I want to look at the epidemiology of autistic spectrum disorder, focusing on understanding the nature and severity of it, how it is as a health concern, its frequency and causes, and some potential opportunities for mitigation or response. So what is autistic spectrum disorder? This is a complex developmental condition involving persistent challenges in three main areas: social communication, so decreased sharing of interest with others, difficulty appreciating their own and other person's emotions, interpreting abstract ideas literally, avoiding eye contact as some of the common social communication challenges. A second area is restricted interest, which might include inflexibility of behavior, extreme difficulty coping with change, expecting others to be equally interested in subjects that they're passionate about. And a third area is repetitive behaviors. In more severe cases of autism, we'll see issues like rocking as one of those characteristics, but that's rare in the majority of persons. But oftentimes those repetitive behaviors come out in things like a need to arrange things in their world in a certain way, like toys or collections or things like that. Typically, autistic spectrum disorder, it can be noticed by parents and caregivers by about age 1 or even shortly thereafter. And it's usually diagnosed by age 2 or sometimes 4. So it presents early. Currently, the definition includes a cluster, and this is going to be something we'll get into in a moment, that adds in Asperger's syndrome, childhood disintegrative disorder, as well as some other disorders that are not less descriptive. So it has a range of severities, sometimes with varying degrees of cognitive impairment. So we know about situations where there's significant cognitive impairment, but actually that's actually rare. And it's actually quite common, and I'll make that case. So I just want to be clear today about one thing. I want to avoid stigmatizing this condition or somehow making human beings the subject of some kind of impersonal analysis. And so I want to be cautious that I make that clear, because all of us have loved ones or experience with this, and we want it to be handled in a humane and in a kind way. And I sure hope I can do that. So epidemiology is about counting things over time. So is autism facing an epidemic? If you look at the increase from data that the CDC has collected from the Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network, we'll see that there's been a 4-fold increase in reported cases of ASD or autistic spectrum disorder since 2000, up to presently reported 32.2 per 1,000 or 3.2%. So typically an epidemic is something that's considered to be a 10% increase over a baseline. That baseline is often called the endemic level, or sort of the normal basal level that we accept. This is more than a 10%. This is a 4-fold increase. So maybe this is some kind of crisis. But I'd like to engage the audience in a question. When you see this figure, what questions do you have about the nature of the data that's being reported? So from 2000 to 2022, it was reported that we increased from 6.5 to 32.2 cases of autistic spectrum disorder. Now, what might affect that increase? I'll ask you to put on your scientific or skeptical hat. What questions might you have about this data? Yeah.
Possibly a different definition right around 2012.
Yeah, so 2013, so there's a manual called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM, which has been around for a long time, which gives a definition of mental disorders, behavioral health, psychological, psychiatric disorders. George?
Depth of screening?
Depth, oh yeah, intensity of screening, yep. So another example would be intensity of screening. So in 2013, they decided to bring in this cluster of conditions, including Asperger's, and call it autistic spectrum disorder. And so you can see after that, we saw this rapid increase in numbers. So depth of screening is another factor. What other things might explain the increase? What happens when you give it a name and begin screening more intensively?
See it.
People begin looking for it. And so I'll make that case here in a minute. So I'm not going to make we're not going to answer the question yet, whether this is an epidemic or not. The slide is suggestive of something, but we'll now break it down a little bit. So these are the questions that you would ask if you were thinking about this as an epidemiologist. How do these numbers compare to the past? Well, we saw this increase. What are the overall consequences of this number? Are these people, what kind of life are they living? What's the burden of disease for those individuals, families, communities? What is the case definition? That was, I guess Jeff got to that, or diagnostic criteria, and we know it has changed. So these data are subject to what's called ascertainment bias. So cases that had previously not been ascertained as autism now are. Not that they didn't exist previously, but they hadn't been identified, or they now were identified based on a new set of criteria. So the data that we get comes from 16, the ADDM data comes from 16 locations in 16 states. They look for counting all the individuals who meet either a medical, clinical diagnosis, that would be like in your electronic health records, or in an educational setting diagnosis. Either of those count. They count at 4 years and 8 years to get this data that I just showed here. In order to get these numbers. So we have 16 different locations that are being used. So that leads to the issue of geography, which is another epidemiological principle. If something is true of humanity, is there geographic variability? So this is the same data that I showed previously, except this is by state. So the state on the far right is California. California has the highest prevalence at, it looks like over 50 per 1,000. Well, why might that be? It turns out California has what's called a Get Set Early model, where pediatricians are trained to screen and refer children for assessment as early as possible, as well as regional centers throughout the state that provide this evaluation. The second highest is Pennsylvania, which has the unique Medicaid model of saying any child who is eligible for services, regardless of whether their parents are Medicaid eligible, to receive Medicaid support for it. So you see how the services available by state will increase the numbers. In contrast, the far left is Texas, which has the lowest reported incidence. In fact, the two of the lowest three are from the state of Texas. And so it turns out that if you go into Texas, the rate from the highest income communities to the lowest is 6 times higher. So the unique phenomenon is autism is being detected in wealthier communities and in states who have more programs and more aggressive diagnosis and screening. Another way to compare this is to look at it globally. And so here's another, this is a global burden of disease study. So different data set, different approach. They analyzed 85 peer-reviewed studies representing 29 countries from 1994 to 2019. A few select countries are shown in the table. Now in their hands, the US prevalence was 11.2 per thousand. That's 1/3 of what the ADDM reported. Furthermore, as you can see, all these other countries are much lower. And then as you'll see over time from 94 to, those are years, to 2019, we still saw like this 4-fold increase by country. But what we observe is the same phenomenon that's happening in the US by state is also happening by country. So the countries that had the highest reported prevalence are the countries that were the wealthiest countries. And also the studies that were done more recently always had a higher prevalence than older studies. Now that could mean that there is an increase in actual conditions, but it's also suspicious of having been aggressive identification. That same study shows this information, which is prevalence divided by gender. And from this, we can pick out a couple of important points. First is that males present at 2 or 3 times the prevalence of autism to meet females, but we'll also notice this decline over time. Now, this is not because individuals tend to like that autism goes away, but it's because where the curve bends down on the right, those are individuals who were born between 1930 and 1956. The DSM only identified autism as a thing in 1952. So those people who are older than age 70 on this, it wasn't even a thing when they were a child. And then later in life, it got diagnosed. So these are all leading us to suggest that perhaps this is an issue of aggressive diagnoses, higher prioritization, increased service delivery, and that we probably do not have an epidemic. Another thing I'd like to think about is the experience of what's called neurodiversity. You've heard this word, it's been a kind of a popular word in the last few years. What do we mean by neurodiversity? Now you're going to have to think a little bit like statistically here for just a second. But neurodivergence simply means a divergence in mental and neurological function from what is considered typical or normal. So neurodivergent is often paired with like neurotypical. And what that really means is the bell curve says the majority of the middle are typical And if you're outside that, then you're divergent. Simply put, it's kind of like that bell curve mentality. Now, this study is an interesting study that I need to unpack a little bit. This study is about 5,000 people mixed up of neurotypical and neurodivergent. Among them were 811 who had an explicit diagnosis of autism. They then were run through an ASQ survey, which is a 50-question self-completed survey of autistic tendencies. It has a high validity, it's highly regarded. But what you find is the distribution, so how to read this is, the bottom is the ASQ scores for all the survey participants. The y-axis is the frequency or the number of people who had that condition. So a score of 10 is a low score. It would mean very low number of autistic tendencies in that person. And so 10 would be this many persons. And I don't know exactly what that 0.035 means, but just think of number of persons. So that many persons had very few. A few more were up in the 20s, let's say, and the cutoff for autism is 26. Now, the second thing I want to point out, so you see this normal distribution skewed to the right. Now, the yellow are neurotypical persons. To no surprise, the majority are below 26, therefore not self-reporting as having autistic tendencies. But a fair number do. So above the line, all these yellow bars are individuals whose inventory reported autistic symptoms, but they've never been diagnosed as such. On the other hand, the blue lines are those who have an explicit diagnosis of autism, but as you can see, about 15% of them scored below the cutoff of 26. This is what's meant by neurodiversity, is we have this broad, in this red box, we have all these persons, a bunch of people who do not have autism, but they present with symptoms. But then we have a bunch of people who are diagnosed with autism, but whose symptoms are mild. This is what the diversity is about. So in some ways, you could say we're all in this together. So this shows us that there's a range of severity with autism. Up here is going to be more severe. So it's no surprise those that are diagnosed, that curve sort of normalizes up here, and they're going to have more symptoms. So that's the expression that there is a range of severities. And it also shows that neurological differences are a reflection of diversity and not deficiency. Now, of interest to many of us is educational experiences of persons with autism. So this is a study that shows the number of persons who pursue higher education and then the number who complete it. So on the left side, you'll see 52% of the general population go to college. 62% of those graduate, meaning 32% of the general population graduates from college. On the other hand, only 36% of people with autism go to college, and only 39% of them graduate from college, meaning only 14% of persons with autism. And this is persons who do not have cognitive deficit. So this is eliminating those with whom autism presents with cognitive deficit. So something is happening in their college experience that's causing them to have less success. Let's think about the symptoms, right? Social communication challenges, restricted interests, repetitive behaviors. And my question is, what are we doing in the university to allow that intellectual capacity to flourish? And to allow them to graduate from college at less than 40% of the rate of other students. And I can only, imagine what that would mean. It's how to create routine, how to create consistency, how to minimize bad experiences with other persons while on campus. Another interesting consideration from the same study, which is from the National Longitudinal Transition Study, which is a study of 11,000 high school kids who then they follow them to see what happens when they get done with high school. And this is a bunch of varying types of disabilities. So I just pulled out the autistic spectrum disorder one. And what you'll notice is 34% of those who go to college choose STEM fields. Much higher than those with autism who choose healthcare or social sciences. And of those who choose STEM fields, a large majority prefer computer science. And I don't know, why that is, but it turns out that 34% of autistic kids choose STEM fields, and only 22% of neurotypical kids choose STEM fields. We've got a superpower. We can't afford to see them fail to finish college. Bill Gates, Albert Einstein, Grandin, what was her first name?
Temple Grandin.
Temple Grandin, legendary animal science expert. Okay, so this leads to the issue of what causes. So I hope I've made a reasonable case that we probably don't have a crisis, but we have an evolving and an emerging understanding of something that's part of the human experience, but which is a burden for individuals and families and calls all of us to greater attention and compassion. This gets to the question of what causes autism. Now, there's a bunch of things that are being talked about, but it's really complicated. You know, like Parkinson's, it's a very or even stroke recovery, it's a complicated neurological condition. Some of the reported causes, vaccines, we've heard that old canard, you know, the notion of aluminum salts that are used to activate a higher immune response, which are causing, but that's been refuted. Thimerosal, which contains ethyl mercury, which is used as a preservative, has been argued, but that's ethyl mercury, not methyl mercury. Methyl mercury is toxic. It's found in the environment, so people confuse them, but it's not. It's an element that's immediately degraded and expelled from the body. And so this has also been refuted. But because of that, recently the FDA has decided we're not going to allow thimerosal to be included in vaccines. And what that means is we're going to cut the shelf life of the vaccines down substantially and thus double the price of the vaccine. So there's prices, there's costs, literal costs for decisions that are based in other than sound evidence. A second one is thalidomide. You know, this has not been used. It's very rare. It was used in the 1950s for women who are pregnant to manage morning sickness. And it was found in 1961 to be teratogenic, which means it causes birth defects in children. And it hasn't been used. It's now a cancer drug, but it's used very sparingly only in those conditions. So it's still talked about, but it's very unlikely that it could explain anything because it's so rare of an exposure. A third is, you know, Tylenol or acetaminophen. This is the latest consideration. I've read a lot of papers that have evaluated Tylenol and autism association. The best paper I've seen is by a group in Sweden called Ahlqvist. So in 2024, they published in JAMA a paper of 2.5 million children. 185,000 of them were exposed to Tylenol during pregnancy. The exposure was confirmed by a midwife and documented, and 94,000 twins were evaluated in the study. And this study found no association between Tylenol and autism in those children later. Now, what was found was that the mothers in the Tylenol group were themselves at a higher rate of autism. They themselves had a higher rate of frequency of infection. They were less healthy. They had longer chronic pain episodes. They had higher rates of opioid use. So we had very distinct samples of individuals, and therefore, when those were controlled for, there was only a genetic evidence found. Another paper that's been talked about is by Prada. Now, the Prada study, it's been talked about a lot. It's a qualitative review. It's not a true meta-analysis. It's just qualitative. So they took a room of 10 experts, and they each found, or they totally evaluated, I forget the number of papers, dozens, and they evaluated the papers, and then each of them evaluated them by certain criteria. Is there bias? What's the quality of the study? Is it likely to be legitimate? But there was no quantitative analyses done. The problem with that study was that they didn't have any documentation of exposure. So think about a mother who's had a child with autism. And then 9 years later, you say, did you take Tylenol when you were pregnant? What is the risk of what's called recall bias? So I think there's lots of risks and bias in these studies. And it just reminds us that we need high quality studies that are able to ascertain exposure at what time in gestation, at what dose, mixing in genetic influence from a neurodevelopmental perspective, prospectively into the future. And this is what we need to do. The studies should continue, but we need to do the right studies. And so I don't know where this is going to go. And I'm not implying that I know that Tylenol has no association. But at the moment, it doesn't have strong evidence, and so it's still being looked at. Others are in utero maternal conditions. So think about it. For the most part, how does autism happen? A fetus, over the course of neurological development, begins to have a developing brain. It's the synaptic development, it's communication, it's the neural architecture, and under either genetic, inherited factors and or exposure in utero, this condition develops. And so obviously it's easy to imagine, if a mother is taking Tylenol, that could possibly explain it. I'm concerned that mothers are already living with such a burden. They're responsible for the world. Every human has been the responsibility of a woman. And now we're blaming them again. And I'm thinking, I just feel concerned that we're using inadequate scientific evidence to create a public narrative that's both lacking in evidence and harmful to women. Women don't have an option for pain when they're pregnant now because they've been told, acetaminophen's not an option, ibuprofen's not an option, no, acetaminophen's not an option. So then what? So, and it's not based on good evidence. If there was good evidence, yes, protect the baby. But at this point, it seems to be a bit inconclusive. So in utero conditions, folic acid is another one, vitamin insufficiency. There's some other factors, but I think we'll move on. This leads to genetics. Yeah.
Question. Do they have any idea what the mechanism is for the acetaminophen affecting it?
Like a biological plausibility. The blood-brain barrier God made our blood-brain barrier really good. We can take a lot of junk in our body and it's not getting to our brain because of the blood-brain barrier that protects that, because it's so important. In a baby, it's not. And so what the mom takes in, it's going into the baby's brain. So in terms of the biological mechanism or the active agent in Tylenol and how that would affect the formation of the brain, I haven't heard any, really strong arguments. But the notion is just that fetal brain is really subject to insult from whatever the mother consumes. Yeah.
Sorry, one other question. I don't know where we're coming the slides here, but just talked to someone recently and they're divorced couple, and she wanted him to sign off that their child was autistic so she could get $1,500 per month from the government. And she would then be registered, that child be registered as autistic. Is there much of that skews the data as far as the number with autism?
Yeah, that's kind of the point I was making, at the beginning.
Okay, sorry, I missed that.
Yeah. So definitely services available, aggressiveness of screening, intensive. Yes, those are all factors for sure. And which makes us concerned about the data, especially, over time. Yeah, no, that's a factor. Okay. So what about the genetic factor? There's some really good studies that show that the genetic contribution to autism is somewhere between 80 and 90%. It explains 80 or 90% of autism. So on the left side is a study from Webb. You see 60 to 90% of identical twins had concordance of either having autism or not. And on the other hand, fraternal twins who are just like any brother or sister, there was 3 to 30%. The study on the right is Sandin, another study from Sweden. 14,000 individuals, 40,000 twin pairs, and what we found is 83% genetic heritability, and then some other factors that contribute as well. So it's fairly clear that the majority of cases of autism can be attributed to genetic or inherited factors. No gene has been found. Huntington's disease, if you get the gene, you got the disease, and it's a slam dunk. There's nothing like that for autism as of yet. So it's something inherited, a cluster of genes potentially activated by some exposure, environmental or otherwise, that causes this to happen. And we don't know what those factors are. So while genetics clearly plays a role in the etiology, the expression of the genetics that they inherit is definitely susceptible to those environmental factors. So I'm not downplaying that at all. I'm trying to bring some calm to it, shall we say. This leads to a kind of epistemological question called meaning making. Why are we so twisted in knots about it? Why are we as a society having this passionate conversation about autism? This is an issue that's called meaning making. We all want to make meaning out of things that we experience in our lives. When you think about all the health problems that are out there, why this? Why autism? Well, it has some unique characteristics that make it prone to such obsession. First, it has an uncertain cause. 400 years ago, infectious diseases were a complete mystery. So it was concluded that it was a result of miasma, which means funky smog in the air that would just settle on people and cause them to get sick. Over time, we had the germ theory of disease, and we now are not as confused about infections. And few people, regardless of their view towards science, would refuse to take an antibiotic if they had an infection because we've received clarity. But with some conditions, we don't have a lot of understanding, and so we feel like we have lost control over autism. Another is that it affects children. So as parents, you just feel so vulnerable and you just want so badly to understand. People are desperate for an explanation and they want to have control over what's happening with their child. And they may be reluctant to accept that just happens sometimes. Or if there's a faith motive, they might be hesitant to accept God caused this. Or, they want to have an explanation that's external to themselves. So this is why we often end up going into fabulous rabbit holes and why people are prone to following various sources of credibility to answer these types of perplexing questions. So one way of thinking about it is what's called parental attribution. So that is parents, when they see an event and they associate with something, they're inclined to attribute some causal association between the two. When Renee and I first went to China, the first child that we had did not survive. We were in a city that it was reported had a radiation accident. And we immediately assumed that our child was lost because of having lived in this town, even though we had been assured. Remember, I brought radiation detecting devices with me, and I confirmed there was almost no chance that we had been exposed to radiation. But for a long time, we were persuaded that that was the cause. So as parents, you always want to find explanations for things that happen. The second issue with meaning making is what's called motivated reasoning. And that is that some people have ulterior motives for their reasoning process. So some people's motive for their reasoning about the causes of autism is driven by a financial or a political power play. There's an understanding gap or vacuum, which then is prone to people who can then take advantage of that. Whether it's selling concoctions to anxious parents that will cure autism, financial motive, or whether it's preying on the fear of society for political reasons, political motive. There's an irrational reasoning process that does actually make sense when you get to the root motivation. And so these are some of the reasons why we end up with what's called science denial. Science denial is most fertile in areas where the science must be taken by trust. Like I said, there's no denial about antibiotics, but there is about vaccines because we don't totally understand how vaccines work. And frankly, when you're vaccinated, you rarely get the disease. So you're never quite sure, did it prevent me from getting the disease or not? Many people see this loss of understanding as kind of a threat to control, and they want to regain control. And sometimes they'll reject a reasonable explanation in hopes of finding something that gives them a perception of control back. And so I just feel bad that some people are victims of these motivations. And then autistic persons can sometimes be the collateral damage in the public conversation. So the epidemiology summary. Autistic spectrum disorder affects about 2 to 3% of persons with varying degrees of severity. There seems to be a leftward skew, so it's pretty definitive for a majority at a certain level. And then there's a wide range skewing toward the less severe range. The prevalence of autistic spectrum disorder as a fundamental human burden is probably not increasing. The apparent increase likely reflects expanded diagnostic criteria and increased diagnosis and reporting. It's mainly an inherited condition, but we still have a lot to learn. It's unclear whether it's preventable, but the long-term experience of persons can be enhanced significantly through early diagnosis, supportive educational experiences, strong social and family supports, and public policies that work in their favor. And the legal, social, and policy support received is going to vary by state or by locale or even by country. So we need better research that uses a developmental psychopathology approach and prospective design with precise exposure measurements and awareness of the dose and duration at which time in the fetal development, and I welcome that. I don't welcome p-hacking of large data sets that will eventually find all kinds of interesting associations between autism and a million other things. And I'm very concerned that that could happen with our new funding to find the causes of autism. Okay, epidemiology. Next, theological perspective. In April of 2025, the Secretary of Health and Human Services made these preposterous statements. Autism destroys families. Autistic children will never pay taxes. They'll never hold a job. They'll never play baseball. They'll never write a poem. My son's written 2 books. And they're books that flowed from an unbelievable creativity, which is unrestrained by neurotypical ways of thinking. He might write a poem too. They'll never go out on a date. Many of them will never use a toilet unassisted. Now we know that this is true for some people of severe autism, but what a way to characterize what might be up to 1 or 2% of our society. And so to typecast this into this kind of condition is not representative, but to me, it reflects the theological heart of the problem. I believe it reflects a utilitarian view of humanity that sees people in relationship to GDP. People have value because they generate GDP. Conversely, people who consume public resources are a burden on society to be fixed. This is my attempt at good theology. In Genesis 1:26, God said, "Let us make humans in our image, in our likeness, that they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created humans in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. The image of God refers to the elements in the makeup of humans which enable us to fulfill our destiny. The image itself is that set of qualities that are required for relationship with God and with humans. They are qualities of God which are humans reflecting God's goodness, God's glory to each other. Imagine us as a mirror, reflecting God's glory to those around us. It does not mean perfection or sinlessness, and it's not related to intelligence or absence of disability or disease. To be created in God's image is to be his representative on earth, to shine forth the character and glory of God as that mirror of his glory to the world. This is how I'd like to depict it. So we persons have this special connection to God. That's what the image means. I know there's a lot of explanations. Some people think of an image as a bunch of traits that were given. I think of it more as a calling. And then that calling means that we are intended to reflect God to other people. So that's that relationship. So this is our responsibility and our opportunity. Now, this image is worked out in Homo sapiens in 3 distinct domains under the umbrella called personhood. Persons possess bodily, soulful, and spiritual characteristics experienced in community. This is what it means to be a person. And this is found in understanding the coordinated inner working of these 3 characteristics, which are acquired by humans during early development. Personhood is something that develops over time through these bodily, soulful, and spiritual functions in community. Neurodivergence, or being on the spectrum, is not a person's identity. It is how they experience life, but it is not who they are. Now, I want to be clear. Looking at disability in this way leaves in tension 2 poles. On the one hand, we're disabled, all of us, and this disability is a reflection of who we are by the grace of God. It's not a defect, it's not something to be fought or labeled or stigmatized. But at the same time, we are the stewards of the natural world. And science has tools to help people with disease and disability to be healed and to live their highest quality of life. So we never want to passively accept disease and disability without doing our best to figure out why and do something about it. And that's part of what our personhood calls us to. So that personhood then is lived out in our bodies. All persons are embodied in physical bodies. In the New Testament, that's the Greek word soma. Now, autistic spectrum disorder is largely genetic, which is a part of our physical bodies. You know, myelination of neurons and synaptic processes, the feeding of neurons in fetal development, genes interacting. This is what sets up the person that we become. And this is also the setting in which our brains are developed and formed. To be human is also to be soulful. Now, some would conflate soul and spirit, and that's okay if you like to, but I like to distinguish. In the Bible, soulfulness is called, you see in New Testament, psyche or psyche, psychology, psychiatry. So neurology, the body is our brain. Psychiatry, the immaterial reality that functions from the brain, is our soul, or psychological. And in autistic spectrum disorder, the psyche works differently. It's on the outside of neurotypical range. Think back to that frequency histogram that I showed. So things like valuing one's own or others' emotions, interpreting abstract ideas, inflexible behavior, being strongly focused on niche subjects, these are part of the soul, the psychology of a person on the autistic spectrum. It's not good or bad, but it's not typical. And nor is it irrelevant, because sometimes they might need help overcoming these tendencies in order to improve their quality of life and improve their interactions with others. This body and soul person is also spiritual. In the New Testament, it's pneuma. It's describing the ability of the person to be in relationship with God. And as with our physical body and the soul, spirituality is woven in personhood in all of the above. Therefore, the autistic brain results in a unique psychology, which then calls for a potentially unique spiritual formation. We're looking for spiritual formation in all persons. But when is our approach to spiritual formation not working for someone on the autistic spectrum? We all need fellowship. Hebrews 10, 23 and 24. But what if going into a setting of fellowship, you end up feeling standoffish? People are standoffish toward you because you're on the spectrum and they hold you at arm's length. So how do we help individuals form spiritual life when their psychological orientation is atypical? Some of the things that I've observed, literalness can be conducive to a deep trust in God. My children trust God 100 times more than I do. Their tendency toward literalness is if God says it, it's good. Let's go. That's an inspiration to me. It's like what Jesus called the faith of a child, which we all need to enter the kingdom of heaven. Sometimes difficulty with abstraction means, I have 2 children who cannot tell little white lies. We need more of that honesty. But that literalness can also cause them to be painfully honest and strain their relationships. But likewise, they're less likely to guess about people. They just take them as they are, take them at face value. So autism makes it more difficult to represent other minds as well. I think empathy is one of those issues. So when you think about spiritual formation, I think, what does it mean when we place our spirit into the hands of God, when we rise in prayer in the morning? And what if you struggle to be able to imagine this experience of your spiritual need with an immaterial God? These are potential challenges that are there, and we're called to help each other in our spiritual formation. There's a lot that could be said about autism and the transformed life, but I've been blessed by what I have learned. Finally, this bodily, soulful, and spiritual person exists in community, or koinonia. The interworking of all those characteristics in community to realize one's personhood is to attain the bodily, soulful, and spiritual peace of shalom. One's personhood can be fully realized on this earth as we're conformed to the image of Christ, who alone is fully human. And that's what we all desire. Persons on the autistic spectrum are wholly human. We all have distinct bodies, souls, and spirits that form in community, and we should embrace them as well. At the risk of hermeneutical, like carelessness, I'd like to read 1 Corinthians 12 to you. Even so, the body is not made up of one neurotype, but of many. Now, if the neurodivergent should say, because I'm not neurotypical, I don't belong. It would not for that reason stop being part of the body. If the whole body were neurotypical, where would the distinctive types of neurodivergence be? But in fact, God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as he wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many neurological types, but one body. This leads to my final thought, which is quite short, which is this whole topic in pastoral perspective. I'm not a pastor, so when I say pastoral perspective, I think shepherding, kindness, spiritual, looking out for each other, tending to one another's spiritual needs. But it does apply to how our churches could or should function. So pulling it all together in pastoral perspective, autistic spectrum disorder as a spectrum is a reflection of diversity, not deficiency. But it is a disability, calling for human kindness, social support, and appropriate policies and programs. Autism is not a result of personal sin, but it is a reminder of a fallen world with hurt and sadness. People need to be informed and helped to understand neurodivergence. Autism, I hope I've made the case that it's not a crisis or an epidemic, but it's a slow-moving chronic disease that calls for more concern, more research, more policy, more funding, more attention to provide the best opportunity for these individuals. How we treat people with disabling conditions is a reflection of how we treat Christ, and we see this is where the image comes in. Matthew 25, when did we give you a cup of water? It's when you did it to this person. And so that's because this person bears the image of Christ. And so the neurodivergent. Autistic persons exist within individuals. Autism exists within individuals who live within communities, and we need communities that are completely humble and gentle, patient, and bearing with one another in love. Therefore, they need space and grace for all personality types, not only for selective personalities. Neurodivergent persons are fully part of the body of Christ, and we should be looking for God's special gifts to the church from them. I hope churches become more open, more informed, more willing to embrace persons of neurodivergence in their community. In closing, you may remember The Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. He used a simple picture of children to try and convey the failings and immaturity of us as humans. And you may recall that in the end, they were crowned as kings and queens. And that was C.S. Lewis's way of depicting that we journey through this life and that someday we'll be crowned as kings and queens in God's kingdom. And you may remember Lucy crying out, "We're all kings and queens now." I hope that we can appreciate the royalty, but more crucially, the royalty of ourselves as a gift of God in his image, and also those around us, whatever the case may be. And today I'm talking about autism. We each wear a crown that marks our role in God's reign, a reflection of God's image. And in time, we will all be kings and queens. Let's live like it. Sorry for getting emotional, but it's personal, and I hope it didn't compromise the quality of what I had to say.